All of us as psychologists, or really anyone who studies human interaction, human behavior in any way, has faced this problem. And that is that what we are trying to do in terms of understanding why people do the things that they do, not only to be able to explain it, but importantly to be able to predict it, is really quite extraordinarily challenging and difficult. Within the realm of the work that I'm going to be talking about today, some of the things that are often brought up when folks discuss issues related to violence are big, big picture questions, like what causes school shootings? Is gun violence really a problem of having too many guns available? Or is it really, in fact, that gun ownership is really only a problem if folks have mental health concerns? And when we boil it right down, what a lot of us who study aggression and violence are trying to understand is not so much at this big picture level, but more at this kind of everyday level of under what circumstances will otherwise good people attempt to harm others. And so the work that I'm going to be talking about today is really kind of framed within that type of question. When I was asked to speak at this year's series, I was told that the series had something to do with kind of controversial topics explored from a psychological point of view. And so the work of mine that I guess best exemplifies controversy is in fact the work that we've been doing on effects of media violence. And particularly, we've been studying effects of violent video games on different aspects of aggression. And so the question that is posed by this kind of work and by many thinkers and policymakers is, does exposure to entertainment violence cause increases in aggression and or violence? And I'm going to talk about the different aspects of that question here in a few minutes. And really, it's kind of an issue of whether you think this is a controversy or not depends upon sort of which axe you want to grind. Many in the scientific community would argue that there is no controversy, that this question has been settled over and over and over again in the affirmative. But there are others who would disagree with that point of view, and they tend to make a lot of noise. So we'll talk about that. The media have a tendency to, of course, make every story appear as though it's a brand new event, as though these issues have, never been discussed before in some respects. But of course, if you think about it, violence has been a part of entertainment really since the dawn of recorded history in one way or another. So you think back to the Romans, who of course were famous for enjoying watching folks fight each other in the Colosseum, reenacting sea battles and so on. Fast forward to the plays of William Shakespeare, many of which were rife with violence and retribution. And the first ever kind of widely distributed motion picture, which was called The Great Train Robbery, was really a short film, only about 9 minutes long, consisted of 14 scenes, but fully half of those scenes contained some kind of violence or aggression. This photo here, this famous picture for any of us in the audience who are film buffs, you might recognize that this is the leader of the bandits. So this film is about a train robbery, as the name would suggest. In fact, it's a great train robbery. And the leader of this gang of robbers, in the end of the film, turns his pistol towards the camera and fires into the camera. Now, these days, that sounds very tame by the standards that we're used to in terms of aggression and violence in media. But it was quite striking and very unsettling to folks who first saw this film. And so there were reports of folks running, screaming down the aisles out of the movie theaters at the end of the movie because they were afraid they were going to be shot. So anyway, the idea is just that violence has been a part of our fun, of our entertainment for many, many, many years. These days, when we talk about violence in media, especially entertainment media, we're usually talking about very, very gory and graphic kinds of scenes like this. These are stills taken from some of the most popular video games on the market today. And so some of them are kind of realistic fighting war kinds of games, but many times it's just kind of urban combat, chainsaws, lots of automatic weapons, lots of blood and gore, and stuff like that. And so when we talk about how much violence is in the media, many times people aren't really fully aware of what it is that we're talking about. I gave a presentation to the Missouri Senate some years ago now about an issue related to sales of violent video games to young people in the state of Missouri. And the senators really didn't quite have a good grip on what it was that we were talking about. So one of the staffers for one of the senators put together a little 2 or 3 minute clip of different scenes from violent video games. We got about a third of the way through that, and they all were like, okay, stop, stop, stop. That's gross. So the violence that is evident in entertainment media today is really on a different level from things that most people are used to. So going back to the controversy of does media violence cause aggression? Some very kind of powerful folks within the media industry over the years have been quoted in interviews as basically denying that there's any effect of media violence on aggressive behavior, and flipping the question on its head and saying, you know what, violence is just a part of society, and it's our duty as members of the news media, for example, to accurately reflect the level of violence that's in society. So all we're doing is, in a sense, holding a mirror to American society. So if you see violence in the media, on television, in the movies, and so on, it's because the society that we live in is violent. So I think that's worthy of some examination. So does art imitate life, is the question. Over here is a graphic depicting number of violent crimes per hour on average in television shows analyzed across different television seasons from 1998 up to about 2007 at different time slots in the sort of prime time television viewing periods. And you can just clearly see that there's kind of an increasing trend towards more violent scenes per hour, especially in the later primetime slot of 10 to 11 p.m. At the same time, we can look at actual violent crime data from the FBI's uniform crime reports across the same period of time, and what you can see there is a very clear trend towards, in fact, less violence in society itself, at least by this measure. So that suggests that, in fact, art, as entertainment media puts it, is not really reflecting real life. Another way to look at this, murder rates. That's kind of the coup de grace of entertainment violence. So there have been a number of kind of content analyses done on this question. In TV, there are about 12 murders per night, and there are around 400 characters appearing on the various TV shows in a given average evening. So that's a murder rate of about 3%. But in American society, again, this is taken from the FBI, 4.7 murders per 100,000 people, a lot less than that. So again, media is really inflating the extent to which society is violent. And so the question becomes, by that inflation, does the media in fact contribute to society becoming more violent than it would be? This is one of my favorite little facts. So the most murderous place in the real world is Honduras, where 940 murders per million people, and the most murderous place on TV is this fictional place called Cabot Cove, Maine, where Murder, She Wrote took place. Anybody remember this show? Kenny, I know you do. So for a town of about 3,000 people, they were having something like 25 murders a year, so it's kind of a lot. So art imitating life, maybe not. What about some slightly more serious business? So a few years ago, there was a Supreme Court case that got a lot of attention, as most Supreme Court cases do. Brown versus the Entertainment Media Association. This is Jerry Brown, the governor of California, When this case was first brought to trial, it was actually Schwarzenegger versus the EMA, but he was then ousted, so Brown took it over. Anyway, the court decided in this case to overturn a lower court ruling that would have put limitations on sales of M-rated, so extremely violent, video games to children under the age of 17. And in writing for the majority, and this was a 7-2 decision, Scalia had this to say. So these studies, referring to violent video game effects studies, have been rejected by every court to consider them, and with good reason. They do not prove that violent video games cause minors to act aggressively, which would at least be a beginning. So what happens in a case like this, as many of you probably know, is that the court considers briefs that are submitted by any group or individual who has a stake in the outcome. And so there was a group of media researchers, media violence researchers, who submitted a brief trying to outline the basis and evidence for the idea that media violence exposure does cause increases in aggression. There was another group who submitted a brief essentially denying that those studies had any merit. And when it came down, the majority sided with the individuals who were sort of debunking the scientific evidence. Well, where are they getting this from? Here's another figure that I find interesting. So this is put together by a guy called Christopher Ferguson, who's one of the leading opponents of the idea that media violence has any effects on aggressive behavior. And what he's doing here is graphing units of video games sold, and that's the bars, against youth violence in society, serious violent crimes. And just as I showed you before, serious violent crimes, serious violent offenses have been on the decrease, and sales of all kinds of video games have been sharply on the increase. And so his argument is, obviously, there couldn't be any effect of media violence on aggression, or we wouldn't see this kind of pattern. I hope you all saw that I was trying to be a little facetious when I said obviously. These kind of correlational data, of course, don't really demonstrate the kinds of, they don't serve as the kind of evidence that we would look for as psychological scientists to understand this question. But these are the kinds of data that some of the opponents of these studies like to cite. What about the yea-sayers? So there have been a couple of different papers, some big meta-analyses and other kinds of reports published in recent years trying to show or examine the effects of media violence on various kinds of outcomes. This is from a paper published in Psychological Bulletin, arguably the best journal in our field, which reported a meta-analysis of violent video game effects on all kinds of interesting outcomes, aggression, empathy, pro-social behavior. What's important here really is this finding, and I realize it's too small for you to see. Across the bottom here are just different kinds of studies. This is experimental studies, cross-sectional studies, longitudinal, and so on. And here are the average effect sizes of exposure to violent video games on aggressive outcomes. And this one, I think, is the most interesting because these are laboratory experiments where subjects can be randomly assigned to the conditions of interest. And what's of note is that this effect is modest but highly significant. So you've got 0, meaning there would be no effect, and the effect here is about 0.21. So it's a smallish kind of effect, but it's a highly significant effect. A couple of years later, a paper came out reporting the report of a media violence commission that had been put together, and they concluded this. More than 15 meta-analyses examining links between media violence and aggression have been published. All show that greater media violence viewing statistically predicts greater aggression by the viewer. So why are there these different views? Why is it that some group of scientists can come out and say, there are these effects, they're important effects, and other scientists can say, no, those effects don't exist, or they're not important, or whatever? Well, my view of it is it's a matter of perspective. So what counts as evidence? Are we talking about axe murders? Are we talking about the kinds of headline-grabbing mass violent offenses that get in the newspaper? If so, then I agree with the opponents. There is no evidence linking exposure to violent video games or violent media and that level of violence. It's really almost impossible to study that question because it's such a rare event. So we're going to talk in a minute about defining and operationalizing aggression and how we as psychological scientists think about aggression. Another problem is interpretation of effect sizes. So I mentioned that there have been these 15 meta-analyses, and for those of you who don't know, a meta-analysis is an analysis that takes into account all the various studies that have been published on some topic and tries to get an average, average effect for whatever the manipulation is. So these 15 meta-analyses, all of them were conducted at different times, took a look at what was published in the literature and said, what's the average size of the effect of exposure to violent video games on aggression? Well, the range was from 0.15 to 0.29. Any of you who know about correlations know that those are not large effects. But at the same time, they are very meaningful effects when you think about the number of people in society who are exposed to media violence on a daily basis. So whether you think that's an important effect kind of depends on how you look at it. It's not a large effect, meaning that for some people there is no effect. For other people there are modest to large effects. So on average, you put it together, there's kind of a modest effect in the world as we have come to understand it. So again, when we think about this question, does exposure to media violence increase aggression? One of the things we have to take into account is how we define aggression. What do we mean by aggression? Well, psychological scientists define aggression as any action that's intended to harm another being who is motivated to avoid being harmed. That motivational piece is important because it takes things like going to the dentist off the table, right? You know you're going to be harmed. It's not going to be a lot of fun, but you're going in there somewhat willingly because you realize that at the end of the day, there should be some outcome that's good for you. So when you take this as a starting point and you think about aggression can be physical, that's kind of what most people think about, fist fights, gunfights, things like that, or verbal, insults, yelling, stuff like that, and most often emotional or relational. So just doing something to make somebody feel bad, doing something that you know is probably going to make somebody feel bad or ruin their day. All of those kinds of things are aggressive. So by that definition, all of us are aggressive. This is something that I don't think a lot of folks think much about. We are all aggressive at one time or another. So the really interesting question for us is not, is someone aggressive or aren't they? But rather, under what conditions will somebody be aggressive and to what degree? So we're talking about moving behavior around by degrees. We're talking about what are the sort of conditions under which someone will become just this much more aggressive than they would have otherwise. And another important distinction is the one between violence and aggression. So violence is usually defined as very, very extreme forms of aggression. So intent to really inflict serious bodily harm. So by these definitions, all violence is aggressive, but most aggression is not violent. So if I'm somebody who takes this question and says, I only care about whether there's an effect of media violence exposure on violence, on societal violence, well, that's a very different question than the one that I and most scientists are posing, which is, can we determine whether acute, brief exposure to media violence causes somebody to be that much more aggressive than they would have been otherwise? Aggression is, of course, an inherently social behavior. And so in order to study aggression in the laboratory, we have to make participants believe that they're engaged in a social interaction. We do this in various kinds of ways, but one of the best ways in which we can do that is by having what's known as a confederate, or somebody who's kind of working for the experimenters, come and serve as a fake participant so that the real participant believes that they're going to interact with this other person. What I have here is In fact, a video that one of my graduate students, a former graduate students, now a postdoc, Chris Engelhardt, made in the service of not having to have a real Confederate, but having a fake person in the lab. And if I had done all my homework and practiced, I could have played this video for you and shown you how well this really works. But I would just embarrass myself, so I'm not going to do that. But basically, when the subject sits down in the real experiment room, Chris or whoever the experimenter would turn on their video monitor, and suddenly this other person would appear, and we would be telling them, okay, we're connecting the interlab closed circuit TV, and give some instructions, and okay, there's the other experimenter back there, and eventually, right. So Chris asks, "Hi, can you guys see us?" And Scott Saltz says, "Yeah, we can see you guys now." And then some more instructions, and eventually, "Yeah, wave to your friend over there, hi," and then they wave back. So by doing this, we can convince roughly about 85% of the subjects that there really is another person in the next room that they are engaging in this experiment with. What do we do with that other 15%? Well, we can't win them all, so we kind of just we get rid of those data sometimes. How else do we go about measuring aggression in the laboratory? So once we've got somebody hopefully convinced that they're really interacting with another real person, we have to have some kind of a measure that will allow us to, that will permit somebody to behave aggressively in a way that's ecologically valid, in other words, that meets the definition of aggression, intent to harm another person, but in a way that's also ethical. So we can't just set people loose on each other with knives and say, good luck, we're going to sit back and watch what happens. So over the years, aggression researchers have come up with clever ways to measure aggressive behavior in ways that the subject themselves maybe doesn't even recognize as aggression. One of the most popular methods, which was developed largely right here at MU, mostly by Scott Saltz, who has been around here for many years and is a contributor to many of the studies I'll talk about today, as well as studies in other labs. In conjunction with Brad Bushman, who was a former graduate student in this department, came up with this task wherein subjects are told that they're going to compete with their partner, the person they just saw in the video, in a reaction time task. And prior to every trial, they're going to set, using the mouse, they're going to set the level of noise and the duration of noise that the other subject will hear through their headphones if they lose. So in other words, I'm going to engage in this task with you to see who can press the space bar the fastest once the square turns blue or green. And if I beat you, then you have to experience whatever level of noise I set for you through those headphones. If I lose, then I have to experience whatever noise level you set for me through those headphones. Now, typically, all of this has been predetermined. We don't actually have subjects really blasting other people, but we want them to believe that they are. So by doing that, these noise blasts are pretty uncomfortable. We believe that it meets the definition of trying to cause another person harm. One of our current favorites is called the cold presser task. This is another measure of aggression that we use. If you've ever been at a barbecue or a picnic and you've kind of, it's late in the afternoon and you're fishing around at the bottom of the cooler to find that last beverage, if you have your hand in the water for a little while, it becomes pretty uncomfortable. And in fact, it becomes painful in a short period of time. So what we do in many studies is we'll tell our subjects that one of them, either themselves or their partner, is going to be randomly assigned to experience a distraction. And the distraction involves putting the person's hand in a tray or a tub of ice water. This water is about 40 degrees, so it's pretty darn chilly. And we say to them, so here's the coin toss. Okay, great. You've been randomly assigned to recommend how much distraction the other person should receive. And it can be from 0, meaning no distraction at all, up to extreme, very distracting 50 seconds in the ice water. And this is another measure that we believe meets the definition of aggression, but doesn't leave any lasting imprints as long as somebody isn't really sticking their hand in the water for very long. Of course, as psychological scientists, and especially as a social psychologist, I love me some boxes and arrows. So we have theoretical models that are meant to help us understand what we think are the important factors predicting the outcomes that we care about. This model is derived mostly from something called the general aggression model by Craig Anderson and his colleagues, which is, at its heart, just a very, very old school social psychological model, which is that factors relevant to the person interact with situational factors to change things about the internal state of the individual, which then influence important outcomes. Applying that to media violence, the person-level factors are things like personality traits, maybe learning history. Situational factors would be exposure to media violence, maybe other contextual factors in which that exposure occurs. Internal states would be things like inhibitory control, the kinds of attributions or explanations that people make for what's happening in their environment, their thoughts, their feelings and motives. And then outcomes that we care about would be both short-term kind of acute effects, so aggressive behavior or pro-social behavior, and then more chronic exposure effects, longer-term effects like changes in one's worldview, changes in one's perspective on how hostile or violent society really is, and something called desensitization, which I'll get back to. So I'm going to turn now to some of the studies that we've actually done in my lab in recent years related to this issue. As Kenny kind of mentioned, we do a number of different things in my lab, and one of the areas of research that we're interested in is what are the kinds of situational or contextual factors that can increase aggression? So one of those things is video game violence. Other things would include alcohol and the presence of weapons. I'm not going to get to those other things today, but you can look at Chris Englehart's paper if you want to see the rest of those things. So thinking about the topic for today, the video game question, we have a number of questions that we've asked about video game effects on behavior. So we want to know what are the short-term or acute effects of exposure to video games on aggressive and pro-social outcomes, and the duration of those effects, how long do they last? We've also been interested in effects on brain activity, brain responses to violence. This is an area of work that I think is very promising because it gets around some of the questions of are people able to control their responses and so on. So we'll talk a little about some of those data. And then finally, a more recent development. There have been a number of studies published over the past 10 years or so touting the potentially important benefits of playing violent video games for things like attention, especially visuospatial attention. And so we have a couple of studies that we've conducted in this area to try to tease apart whether those so-called benefits are in fact benefits, and again, depending on your perspective on them. So back in about 1997 or 8, when I was a graduate student, one of the folks that I worked with here, in addition to the people that Kenny mentioned, was Craig Anderson, who was a professor here for many years. I was interested in working with Craig because he had done a lot of research on aggression. And one day, in some lab meeting or something, he brought up the idea of studying video games, studying violent video games in particular. And I don't know if I laughed out loud or if I just kept it to myself, but I certainly thought, this is silly. That was my first reaction. Like, why would any of us want to spend our time studying this issue? It can't be that important. But, Craig, I think, he was a visionary, as I'm sure Kenny would agree. And he had some ideas about that this was going to become a more important kind of issue over the coming years. And in fact, I think he was right. So these days, around half of all Americans play video games. That's a lot of people, y'all. And the percentage is much higher among those age 35 and younger. Many of the most popular video games contain violent themes. So it's something that a lot of people do. So that's one reason to study it. Another reason, and I think this is hilarious, so if you think about why is it that people are exposed to advertisements? Well, it's because the folks who are behind those ads believe that exposure to that content will influence your real-world behavior in one way or another, right? They want you to go out and buy stuff. When the former president of Disney ABC Television was asked about media violence, she had this to say: "There's no conclusive evidence whatsoever that televised imagery impacts real-world behavior in any way." Well, if that's true, then they should start refunding all those advertising dollars immediately. Another good reason to study it is because media exposure influences behavior. And so it follows that scientists interested in understanding behavior should maybe care about this topic. So, turning now to some of our work on video games and aggressive behavior. One of the main ideas or theories about why exposure to media violence might increase aggression has to do with something called priming. So this is an old cognitive psychology idea going back many years, that if you expose people to stimuli that are linked in memory somehow with a particular kind of behavior or schema or action pattern, that exposure to that stimulus will increase the likelihood that people will behave in ways that are consistent with that stimulus. So exposure to cues associated with aggression are thought to increase the accessibility of hostile thoughts and feelings and scripts. This process is spontaneous and unconscious. Why is that important? Because a lot of the arguments for why we shouldn't worry about exposure to media violence, especially among adults, is because adults realize that all of this is just fiction. Adults realize that this is fantasy, and adults can separate reality from fantasy. And my argument to that is, so what? It doesn't matter if you know that it's fantasy. A lot of what's going on is going on so far under your radar that you can't really control your responses. So the primary kind of question then is, do violent video games prime or make aggressive thoughts and feelings more accessible? So applying this priming question to violent video games, we should see that violent video games make these thoughts and feelings more accessible for a period of time. But importantly, if priming is at the root of these kinds of effects, we should see these effects go away relatively quickly. So when some mental content has been made accessible, if it's not acted upon pretty fast, it's just going to fade out because our attention is pretty short term and it's drawn to other things. So a former graduate student in my lab, Mark Sester, and I ran some studies to test whether or not violent video game exposure effects act like priming effects. So in the first two studies, subjects were randomly assigned to play either a violent video game or a non-violent game for a period of 25 minutes, or in some studies they did nothing, no game at all. And then they were randomly assigned to what we call the delay condition. So in the typical media violence study, subjects play a game for some period of time, and then immediately thereafter, some aggressive measure is taken. We did a condition like that, but also a condition where subjects waited 15 minutes before we measured their aggressive behavior. And we were interested in, do video game effects fade quickly over time? And alternatively, do nonviolent games have unique effects of their own? So another question we were interested in here is, maybe having people play a nonviolent video game as a control is not a very good idea because nonviolent games are not neutral necessarily. They may have a unique and opposing effects. So here are some of the results from the first study. The measure here was how likely are people to complete a word and make it an aggressive word versus a non-aggressive word. So this is thought to indicate how quickly aggressive thoughts are coming to mind relative to other kinds of thoughts. So if you have a word like H space T, you can complete it as hit, which is an aggressive type word, or with hat, which is not an aggressive word. And so this is the likelihood that people use more aggressive word completions. And what you can see here is a significant interaction. People who played the violent game and who completed this measure right away were more likely to make aggressive word completions than folks who played a nonviolent game. But if you waited 15 minutes to assess those things, that difference had gone away. And moreover, these changes were significant. So folks who were assessed immediately and had played a nonviolent game were actually less likely to use aggressive word completions than the folks who played that same game but waited 15 minutes to do the measure. So that was interesting. We thought, wow, there could be something about these nonviolent games that contributes to these effects. Same kind of idea here with something called state hostility. This is just a questionnaire. Ask people to say kind of how angry are you right now, how frustrated are you right now, and things like that. So if subjects complete that immediately after playing a violent game, they report feeling more hostile. But if they wait 15 minutes, that effect has significantly decreased. And folks who wait 15 minutes after a nonviolent game report feeling significantly more hostile than their counterparts who were measured right away. Of course, really the coin of the realm in all of these studies is aggressive behavior, not so much how likely are you to fill in a letter with an aggressive versus a non-aggressive word. So we had folks in this other study complete the CRT. This is the noise blast task that I described earlier. And here are the results for that study. So again, the same kind of pattern. When people play a violent game and are assessed immediately, they're more aggressive compared to either those who didn't play any game or those who played a nonviolent game. And when we do the change scores over 15 minutes, there's a significant decrease for those who played a violent game and a significant increase for those who played a nonviolent game. So this was some of the initial first evidence that we ever came up with that, yes, violent video games do affect aggression, but it's a pretty short-term kind of effect. And also that nonviolent games might have their own unique effects on aggressive outcomes. We did a third experiment to kind of drill down a little further into this nonviolent game thing. And we thought, there is some evidence that people who play pro-social games, so video games with explicitly kind of helpful themes, that they're more likely to be helpful right after they play those games, not surprisingly. But maybe there's something just inherently kind of calming or some kind of effect of any game that doesn't include a violent theme. So these are the kind of games we're talking about here with nonviolent themes. So this is Tetris, so you have to kind of move the shapes and put them in the right order. And this is a game called Zuma. I don't know if any of you have ever played these. These are kind of old, but in any case, they're not explicitly pro-social games. They don't have any helpful themes at all, but they're not violent at all either. So the question is, might nonviolent games have similar kinds of effects to pro-social games? So in this study, we had subjects complete stories. So you have people read a potentially stressful scenario, such as after a car accident or something like that, and you ask people to fill in what happened next in the scenario. And then those are coded for helpfulness, aggression, all kinds of other things. And also a word stem completion, which is the same thing I showed you before, where you have part of a word and it needs to be completed, and it can be completed in either a neutral way or perhaps in a helpful way. And here are those data. So for the word completions, folks who played a violent game completed more of the words aggressively than folks who played the nonviolent game. That's kind of what we saw before. But the pro-social effects were in the opposite direction. So, and the same basic pattern occurs for the story completions. So the bottom line for this set of studies is that it seems that just playing a nonviolent game, one of these puzzle-solving games, might have some pro-social kinds of effects, at least in the short term. So I've been talking about this issue of priming, this issue that when you expose people to some content, some stimulus, it should make thoughts and feelings relatively more accessible for a short period of time. A former postdoc in my lab, Chris Lurch, who's now at the University of Colorado, came up with an alternative priming model that I think is very interesting. He calls this the situated inference model. And his idea basically is that the reason priming effects work is because people misattribute the source of their internal states. So if you're exposed to a prime, some kind of stimulus that makes you think or feel in a certain way, but you don't know that that prime is going to make you feel that way, then you may behave in accordance with the prime. You may behave in whatever way you're consistent with whatever way you're feeling or thinking. But if you correctly attribute those thoughts and feelings to that external stimulus, then maybe you won't follow through and behave in accordance with it. So we wanted to apply this idea to violent video games, and by we, I'm referring mostly to Chris Engelhardt. So video games affect aggression by changes in those internal states that I mentioned before. The situated inference model predicts that video games will predict aggression, but only when subjects misattribute the source for their internal states. So if they don't recognize that the video game that they just played could change their feelings and thoughts. So if so, providing the source of that information should eliminate the video game effect on aggression. That's the main prediction here. So we ran a number of studies, mostly Chris ran these studies, to test some of these predictions. So he had subjects play, in this set of studies, all of them played a violent video game for 15 minutes. Then they completed, in this first couple of studies, the competitive reaction time task under one of two conditions. So again, the typical procedure is that people play a video game for some period of time, and then the experimenter comes in, switches off the system, and says, okay, now we're going to have you do this other thing. In the really interesting part of this design is that we had subjects in some cases play a game, and then the experimenter would come in and not turn the game off, but leave the game running while the aggressive dependent measure was measured. That was a lot of measures. So we were interested primarily in, does leaving the video game on ironically reduce aggression relative to turning it off? So traditional priming model would predict that leaving the game on should continue to prime aggressive thoughts and feelings and should therefore ramp up aggression. But our prediction, and Chris's prediction, was in fact the opposite, that we should see aggression reduce under these conditions where the game is still on. So here are the results of that initial study. This is the intensity of those loud noise blasts. For the first trial of the CRT, so you're setting the noise blast for your opponent before you know what your opponent is going to do to you. So this is unprovoked aggression. There was no effect of whether the game was left on or not. But after the second trial, you can see everybody gets more aggressive, but particularly if the game system has been turned off. So if the game is continuing to play in the periphery as you're setting the noise blast levels for your opponent, you're actually less aggressive than if the game is shut off. Another study in this series, so what about the contents of what's going on in the periphery? So maybe it's the case that just having something going on in the periphery is distracting in some way, and so people can't focus their attention on really, retaliating against their opponent. So we, again, had subjects play the violent game for 15 minutes, and then randomly assign them to have the game continue to play, or to have a non-violent game play in the periphery, or to have nothing going on in the periphery. And here are the results. So basically, the same pattern that we would have seen before. When the violent game is left on, people are less aggressive than when the game is turned off, or when a non-violent game is on in the periphery. So that suggests that it's not just about being distractible or whatever, because when the non-violent game is playing in the periphery, people are still just as aggressive. One more extension of these studies, and then I'll move on to something else. So this time we wanted to try a different kind of provocation and a different aggression measure. So had subjects again play the violent game for 15 minutes, and then game was either left on or turned off, and they were provoked in a different kind of way. This is a classic social psychological way of pissing people off, essentially. So you have subjects come in, write about a topic that's very, very fraught with emotion, so usually something like pro-life or pro-choice. You have the subjects write a short essay for 5 minutes on this topic, exchange it with their partner, and their partner then evaluates their essay and gives them feedback. And of course, we manipulate the kind of feedback that they get. In the provoking condition, the feedback they see is, this is one of the worst essays I've ever read. In another condition, we say sometimes, I can't believe this person's actually in college, things like that. versus a non-provoking kind of neutral, yeah, this is pretty good, not bad. And then, after they receive this feedback, they are again asked to give their recommendation for how long their essay evaluator should have to put their hand in the ice water. And here are the results. So again, when folks are not provoked, so getting the kind of neutral, nice feedback, they're kind of not so aggressive, and it doesn't matter whether the video game has been left on or not. Once they're provoked, however, and the game is turned off, they become much more aggressive than when the game is left on. And what's most interesting to me about this, as an aggression researcher, this is, I think, the first time that I've ever seen a manipulation like this that kills the provocation effect. It just wipes it out totally. So normally, provocation is the one surefire way to get people to behave aggressively in the laboratory or anywhere else, right? You call somebody an idiot, give somebody the finger, you're pretty likely to get some kind of retaliatory response. And that's kind of what this essay evaluation is doing. But when we leave the video game playing, people don't retaliate. This is very unusual. So it's a pretty powerful, I think, demonstration that when you give people an external source for whatever it is that they're thinking and feeling after playing a violent video game, they can correctly, if you will, attribute those hostile thoughts and feelings to that external source and not take it out on their partner. So, guess what? Violent video games increase aggression. It doesn't last that long, and the effects appear to depend on how people attribute what it is that they're thinking and feeling. Wow, this is going really fast. So, I'm going to just breeze through a few more studies to tell you a little bit about some of the research we've done on desensitization, because I'm kind of most interested in that work. So, the whole question of desensitization, right? The idea that something that's initially aversive can eventually elicit less emotional response, less psychological response over time than it did at first. This is adaptive in some situations. So when people are sent into battle, they need to become pretty quickly desensitized to the whole scene, the blood, the gore, the carnage, if they're going to continue. The same thing could be true for trauma surgeons or doctors in training at the ER. But it's not adaptive in most other situations because we want to have a pretty severe response to a situation that might be threatening or dangerous, or a situation where another person might need help. We want to be able to feel badly about that so that we'll do something about it. Well, the question of whether exposure to media violence causes desensitization has been around forever. Well, not forever, but for a long time. And there have been a lot of studies that seem to suggest that yes, in fact, if you expose people to media violence, they become desensitized to violence occurring in other contexts, so away from the media experience. There's less evidence that that actually contributes to aggression, however. So in theory, becoming desensitized to violence can cause increases in aggression for a number of reasons. Aggression seems more normal. People sort of have a more hostile worldview. They become more calloused and less caring about other people's pain. But there's not a lot of evidence for this in the literature. In my lab, we're always thinking about what's going on in the brain. How is it that the things that we're doing to subjects in the laboratory, these situations we're concocting, how are they affecting how the brain responds to these stimuli that we show people? Well, one way to measure brain responses in my lab is through something called the event-related brain potential. And I'll tell you in a second, there's a specific aspect of that potential that allows us to measure what we think is important for desensitization. So there's this structure in the brainstem called the locus ceruleus. It's involved in physiological responses to stress. It's the main site in the brain for synthesizing norepinephrine, which is key to what most people refer to as the fight or flight system, right? This idea that when we're exposed to a threat, we have to make a decision. We have to become motivated to either do something defensive or to just get the heck out of there. So the responsiveness of this system should be a pretty important indicator of whether we have a kind of normal response to violent situations or whether we've kind of lost some of that response. So as I said, we measure that in my lab using event-related brain potentials. So put electrodes like an electrode cap like that on subject's head. Allows us to measure the tiny, tiny little neurochemical, electrical events that happen when the brain is processing information. In particular, the P3 component has been linked to this locus coeruleus norepinephrine response. And so when we show people images that evoke some kind of emotional reaction, we should get a large P300 response. So here are the questions that we've asked in this series of studies. If exposure to virtual violence is associated with desensitization to violence, then we should see that P3s elicited by violent scenes should be smaller in people who've been exposed to violent games, whereas P3 responses to other kinds of stimuli should not be affected. And furthermore, we think that this neural indication of the locus coeruleus sensitivity should perhaps predict increased aggression. So this might be one of the mechanisms by which violent media increases aggressiveness. The first study we ran on this question, we had 39 undergraduate men just complete a measure of how much video game violence they normally expose themselves to. So we were not manipulating which kind of experience people were having in the lab, but we were just measuring it. We had people complete then a picture viewing task, and then finally subjects completed the aggression measure, the CRT. So I'll warn you, some of the pictures I'm about to show you are a little bit grisly, so I hope everybody's had their lunch and they're feeling okay. So these are the kinds of pictures that we use. So photos that are rated as neutral, not very arousing, not very positive or negative. Some that are quite negative but not violent, and then some that are both negative and violent. And so the real question is, will video game violence exposure cause a change in the brain's response just to these kind of pictures and not to those other kinds? So here are the results for this first study. I'll orient you a little bit. So this is the amplitude of the brain response. Bigger is down, and this is the time since the onset of the picture. This P3 thing that I was mentioning is this big positivity in voltage right here. This is a highly significant interaction. Suggests basically that people who have a lot of previous video game violence exposure have a smaller brain response to violent pictures compared to their peers who don't have very much previous exposure to video game violence. Their responses to negative pictures, though, are unaffected. So it's a pretty specific kind of effect. How does that relate to aggression? Well, we have this nice scatter plot showing a pretty strong, robust negative association. The smaller one's brain response to violent images, the more aggressive was their response in the laboratory. But of course, that's not very strong evidence. That's just correlation. It's just 39 people. So we asked the question that I think most of us were most interested in: could we demonstrate a causal effect of video game violence exposure on desensitization? So we did another study where we had 35 subjects who had a lot of previous game exposure and 35 who did not. And we invited them to come to the lab and play either a violent game or a non-violent game for 25 minutes, then do the picture viewing task that I just showed you, and then do the aggression measure. Okay, so first off, we have a standardized measure of aggression here. This is combining their noise intensity and their noise duration. And basically the typical violent game effect, so folks who played the violent game were more aggressive. But here's the really interesting data, I think. So here's our friend, the P300 again. And you can see that for people who had a lot of previous video game violence exposure, it didn't matter which game they played in the lab. Their brain response to those violent pictures was stunted in a way. So this is consistent with the previous data. But for those who didn't have a lot of previous video game violence exposure, there was a significant experimental effect. So if they had played a violent game for just 25 minutes, their brain response subsequently to violent pictures was reduced. So this is the first kind of experimental evidence of this phenomenon in brain activity. And then we ran a mediational statistical model to try to test whether the brain's response to violence significantly predicts aggressive behavior, and in fact it does. And when you put them all in the model together, by accounting for this effect, you eliminate the otherwise modest but significant effect of the game condition on behavior. So I'm going to summarize just quickly here and bust through a bunch of, sorry, Joe. There's Joe. He's awesome. Woo! Joe had some great stuff, but we're running out of time here. So it's pretty good, though. Look at that. Isn't that? That's pretty impressive. So to summarize, brief exposure to violent video games increases aggression. I'm going to stand firm on that. Aggression as I defined it, as social psychologists define it. Not necessarily school shootings, going postal on people in your community. But aggression, yes. At least 3 mechanisms seem important. Accessibility of relevant thoughts and feelings, how we attribute those thoughts and feelings, and then potentially desensitization as well. Previous gaming experience can alter visuospatial attention. This is Joe's thing that we didn't get to talk about. But whether that's good or bad kind of depends on your perspective. I guess you'll have to wait for the paper to come out to read about that. So returning to the problem I posed at the very beginning. What causes school shootings? I have no idea. And if any of you figure it out, good for you. Mass violence on that scale is arguably probably one of the most challenging things to understand, let alone to try and predict who is going to do it and when. And we're really, really far from that. And I think it would be silly to even suggest that something like playing violent video games is going to lead to that kind of behavior. We have no basis for saying that. Is gun violence and access to guns problem? This is a hot button political issue, and I'm trying not to be a politician, so I'm not going to say too much about that. But it's the same kind of question as, guns don't kill people. Well, in my lab, no, guns and violent video games and things like that don't kill people, but they do make it more likely that people will try to hurt somebody one way or another. The bottom line is that we believe that anybody is aggressive under the right circumstances, and our goal is to understand what are those circumstances and maybe, in the long run, have some kind of a hope of reducing the likelihood of aggressive behavior. One more mention of the Supreme Court decision. This was in one of the minority opinions. Stephen Breyer had this to say. What sense does it make to forbid selling to a 13-year-old boy a magazine with an image of a nude woman, which the Supreme Court has done many times, while protecting a sale to that same 13-year-old of an interactive video game in which he actively but virtually binds and gags a woman and then tortures and kills her? You're referring to Grand Theft Auto, that very popular series. So these are big questions. This is a societal values kind of question. We apparently don't think it's okay to expose kids or whoever to pornography, but let the violence rip, man. Nobody's going to stop you from doing that. Briefly, I'd like to thank my collaborators who were involved in the studies I talked about today or didn't talk about today, as the case may be, as well as all the members of my lab. And again, just thank everyone for being here and to the committee for having me. Thank you very much.